I am Ryan Grimm. Welcome to the Tuesday live stream for Drop Site News. Today we'll be talking about the latest in the Iran-Israel war. Joining me today will be my colleague, Murtaza Hussain. Murtaza has been covering this war since the very beginning and also covering the region for many, many years now. Maz, how are you?
Morning, Ryan. Good to see you.
And I'm hoping later we'll be able to be joined by our Middle East Bureau Chief Sharif Abdel Qaddous, if he can break away for a second to talk about the latest in Gaza. This morning there was another aid massacre, one of if not the bloodiest of them so far. Already 59 fatalities confirmed by the health ministry, and many others wounded. And you can tell the severity of this massacre by the fact that the IDF has already acknowledged reports of it and said that they are looking into the reports that the passive language they use in the statement, set a new record, but something like uninvolved persons may have been struck by IDF bullets. So for them to have acknowledged it that quickly, suggests its ferocity is reaching new levels. And this is all happening while the world's attention is being averted to Israel's attack on Iran and Iran's ongoing retaliation. To talk about that, we're going to be joined by analyst Farzan Sabet. He's a managing researcher working on Middle East security and sanctions at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Farzan joins us now. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yep. And before you joined, Maz and I were complimenting the carpet behind you. Perfect decor. You said you were on the road, but it happens to fit the circumstances.
Yeah.
So we wanted to start briefly by playing this clip from President Donald Trump. So he was at a G7, G8? I lose count of the number of G's that they
G7
put in this fluctuating group, G7.
Yeah.
So he left early from this meeting. Kicked off a lot of rumors that something major was going to be developing overnight. While he was on Air Force One, he held a long kind of on-camera gaggle with reporters. I'll play a brief portion of this, and then I want to get your. Let me find this here. I think this is it. Yeah, here we go.
Iran should be able to have a nuclear weapon, but how close do you personally think that they were to getting one? Because Tulsi Gabbard testified in March that the intelligence Iran wasn't building a nuclear weapon. I don't care what she said. I think they were very close to having it.
So I don't care what she said. This is of Tulsi Gabbard. I think they were very close to having one. Farzan, any immediate reaction to those comments from President Trump?
The intelligence that the Israelis have purported to have discovered in the lead up to their strike, according to them, reveals that Iran, after the 7th of October, was working on kind of a fast-tracked but still highly compartmentalized weapons option that was nearing the stage of completion. Now, it's surprising if Israel had discovered this throughout this period, but the United States independently hadn't, and if Israel had discovered it separately, that they hadn't prior to that shared it with the United States. So it's an interesting mismatch, and it only seems that Trump is kind of aligning with the Israelis, at least on this particular narrative, much later in the game.
Yeah, Maz, what do you make of him just completely dismissing his own intelligence assessment? Because we're now on the kind of flip side of the Iraq war scenario, where the intelligence community leading into the Iraq war was saying we have an enormous number of doubts about whether or not there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Well, it's not the flip side. It's kind of the exact same thing. The intelligence community is saying there are not weapons of mass destruction in Iran, and you have the president saying, "No, we don't." In this case, he's saying it much more bluntly. So I don't care what she says. They're very close to a weapon. What did you read into that?
It's kind of an astonishing statement in the sense that it's a very, to say that when my director of national intelligence says, I don't care, Trump, that's his style, but still, nonetheless, Well, I think that if you look at the last few days, Netanyahu has said a lot of things about the Iranian nuclear program. He said that the Iranians were planning to transfer a nuclear weapon to the Houthis in Yemen.
Mhm.
He hasn't offered any evidence of that. A very hyperbolic and extreme claims about the program, and suggestions that they may have been a mortal threat not just to Israel from an imminent Iranian nuclear program, but even the United States, and Europe, and so forth. Very extreme 2003 type allegations and rhetoric which are being employed to seemingly incentivize Trump to continue with the current path that they appear to be on. Now, I'm not to psychoanalyze Trump, but I get the impression that like many people who have the misfortune of having to try to parse his statements in a Kremlinology type way, it's very, very frustrating because there's not really a logical through line through all of them. But the impression I get is that he's a bit of a cipher, and then he's vulnerable to being pushed in one direction or the other. Flattery or just proximity, other incentives may push him one way or another. And his tune on the subject is radically different from what it was even 2 weeks ago, when he was suggesting that a deal was imminent, that he really wanted one, and so forth. Now he's saying he doesn't even want to talk to Iran. This is most recent comments about the subject, and stating they were imminently about to have a nuclear weapon. I have the impression, based on himself and also Steve Witkoff's statements about the subject, that they were not deeply read in on the details and mechanics of the dispute over the Iranian nuclear program, past deals, what had been discussed before, what the Iranians said there was their red lines before, and there's a sense of improvisation seemingly happening with the policy. When you have that situation where some people don't know as much, maybe, or they are operating in a situation where they're not have much investment in a subject for many, many years, they're very susceptible to being pushed in one direction by those who do. And I think Netanyahu has made this subject the focus of his entire career, arguably for many, many decades now. And he's very motivated. He has allies in the US Senate and elsewhere, Congress, who can help him push in that direction. And he's getting what he wants now at a critical moment after a pretty intense effort at resisting this among segments of the MAGA base who are against this, but they don't have the cards, to use Trump's term with Zelensky some months ago.
And Farzan, meanwhile, there is some discussion about getting back to the table, going back to the negotiations. Let me put up this post by Mohammed Ali Shabani. He writes, informed sources confirm that Trump is seeking a Witkoff-Vance meeting with Araghchi, this Amwaj Media, leveraging Israel's war with Iran and request for U.S. bombing. Trump may seek final diplomatic resolution. This has tankers set on fire off of the UAE coast. And he goes on to say, Araghchi on June 16th said Iran would continue retaliating as long as Israel hits Iran. Araghchi stated that it would take, quote, one phone call from Trump, quote, to muzzle someone like Israel Prime Minister Netanyahu, adding that may pave the way for a return to diplomacy. So at least there's some discussion of returning to diplomacy. How seriously do you take comments like this?
I don't take them particularly seriously. Part of it is because I think from an Iranian perspective, I mean, there's been some reporting that they're actually reaching out and looking for a return to talks. I'm not sure how they see Trump as being kind of a credible or good faith actor, and that even if they do make a deal, that'll make the pain stop and that'll prevent further Israeli attacks. That's one element of it. I also don't think that the Islamic Republic is at a stage, and it'll be very difficult to even get to this point where it will fully capitulate to the United States and Israel. And I don't see why those two sides, not that they feel they have the advantage, won't just press it and keep moving forward rather than attempt to return to talks. So, looking at it from both the perspective of the Iranians, who have an incentive to try to reach a ceasefire or end the immediate hostilities, but can't trust Trump and don't want to negotiate from a position of extreme weakness, as well as the kind of U.S. and Israel, which now feel they're in a position of kind of supremacy and strength. And I don't see why they won't kind of feel the need to press their advantage. So looking at both sides of the equation, I think we'll see a lot of flirting with potential diplomacy for the coming kind of period. But at the same time, I don't see serious negotiations resuming anytime soon.
And this is a question for both of you, but what happened overnight? Like what can people divine from the kinetic confrontation? Like it started out obviously with Israel wiping out almost the entire upper echelon of some elements of the military. Iran has mustered a substantial retaliation. What did that retaliation look like last night, and how does that affect the kind of balance of power? Either one of you wants, maybe Maz, take that first.
Farzan, actually, I like your analysis. I'd like you to ask a follow-up question about that then, so you can take it from here.
Sure. Well, last night specifically, I mean, the numbers I've seen are something between 10 to 20 missiles launched. This is a substantial kind of reduction compared to, for example, if we go back to Operation True Promise 2 in October 2024, where there was something like 220 ballistic missiles, right? At the same time, I think this could be the reason for launching such a low number of missiles. It could be because the kind of hierarchy has been disrupted. There's some discussion that the IRGC's aerospace force, compared to some of the other elements of the IRGC, was actually highly centralized under their commander, Brigadier General Amir Ali Hajizadeh, and that actually the disruption of the hierarchy then massively affected their ability to kind of reconstitute themselves and continue operations. And add on to that the destruction of launchers, which is basically your capacity to lob those missiles, and a destruction of at least elements of the actual facilities containing missiles. Right. So that could be one element of why they're not firing in terms of volume, the number of missiles they have in the past. Another element is that, there's various estimates out there about how many medium range ballistic missile MRBMs they have, which are the specific type of missiles they need to reach Israel, and that they have in their arsenal that can reach Israel, putting aside cruise missiles and drones. And if there is a serious kind of ceiling on the number of these weapons that they possess, then they're probably, and this, they could see this conflict going on for weeks or even months. They're not going to want to do such massive lobs, but maybe will want to conserve and do smaller volleys. And this could potentially lead into a broader strategy. Something that I've heard from Iranian diplomatic sources is that they're going to try to attempt to create a balance of devastation between Iran and Israel. The kind of thesis being that Iran is being devastated. Israel will also face devastation. And we as Iran, we suffered through the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. We have a higher pain tolerance and greater strategic depth and ability to absorb the pain, whereas the Netanyahu government, having been on shaky ground for some time now, might be much more vulnerable, especially as the euphoria about the early successes of the Israel operations could wear off, and this becomes kind of a war of attrition where Israel, over time, especially if Iran can improve its targeting and its penetration rate in terms of firing missiles, can start to increase the casualty count and the types and nature of targets that it's destroying within Israel.
Farzan, it seems like a lot of the conflict between Iran and Israel at the moment comes down to the stocks of both missiles on one hand and then interceptors on the other. What do we know about the actual missile capacity the Iranians have, and then subsequent to that, the deterrent capacity the Israelis have to shoot down missiles and so forth? Because obviously they're expending a tremendous number of interceptors shooting down ballistic missiles at this time, some of which are operated by American troops as well, to the THAAD missile batteries. Do we have a sense of when that equation may shift, such that these barrages cannot be intercepted? And there's something about the Iranian strategy which could be aimed at exhausting those batteries at the beginning.
Yeah, I think that certainly on the Iranian side, that certainly could be part of the strategy. Now, if they were able to do the kind of larger volume strikes, they would have a better chance of increasing the penetration rate, and also, not giving as much of a chance for the Israelis to refill some of their stocks and kind of re-equip these systems before the next barrage comes in. In terms of specific numbers, I've heard figures in the low thousands, very, very low thousands, in terms of what Iran has left since the beginning of this conflict. Again, very low thousands without going into the specific number. Theoretically, that number would be sufficient to, at some point, in the like foreseeable future, next few weeks or months, depending on the launch rate that Iranians are able to achieve, to exhaust some of the missile stocks that the Israelis have. But whether that's how it'll actually play out in practice, and whether their actual thesis regarding Israeli society kind of crying uncle before they do, that remains to be seen.
And what about the launchers? Because you briefly mentioned the launchers, and I've seen the Israeli side talk about their success at hitting those.
Yeah.
Just as a layperson, you can imagine that every time ballistic missiles are fired, that gives intelligence to the other side of where they're coming from. How quickly are they able to move those such that they can protect them from being destroyed immediately? If Iran has no control over its own airspace and there are jets kind of circling and missiles are fired, and the Israelis can quickly identify where the missiles are being fired from, why wouldn't they just be able to kind of eliminate the launchers? And how hard is it to remanufacture launchers? Is this a complicated 6-month process like for all of our weapons here in the United States, or is this something where you can fairly quickly put together a new launcher?
Yeah. So regarding being able to kind of find and hit the actual launchers once they've fired, my understanding regarding kind of Israel's air defense system is that there is some bandwidth or capacity issues that arise when they're trying to defend and attack at the same time. Right. So they're not necessarily going to have at a time when the missiles are immediately launched, they'll still have some capacity to strike simultaneously, but that bandwidth, because of the reallocation of some of the resources, whether it's aircraft, whether it's kind of the focus of various sensors and systems of that nature, the capacity to track the actual launchers on the ground in Iran and then strike them simultaneously will be reduced compared to when you're not in a kind of a strike phase, right, on the Iranian side. And then in terms of the launchers themselves, I think early in the campaign, we're still in the first week, right? The Israelis appear to have had excellent intelligence and also ability to sabotage Iran's systems, right? And so they probably had a good knowledge of where a lot of these launchers would be and took the early initiative to destroy kind of a sufficient number to then create bottlenecks in terms of Iran's ability to launch missiles, right? In terms of the ability to rebuild them, it's somewhere in there, deeply buried in my workshop notes and the kind of literature about how long theoretically it would take to manufacture one versus a certain number. My sense is that unless Iran is, somehow assisted from abroad with maybe a comparable system that could be quickly adapted, which I don't have any particular insight into, which type of Russian or Chinese, for example, launcher would be, and how long that process of adaptation to Iranian systems would take. Maybe there's an option there that I'm not seeing. But my sense is that again, this is just the first week of the campaign. The Israelis aren't only going after a nuclear facility, missile and drone launch facilities and actual launchers and senior Iranian military personnel. They're also going for key bottlenecks in Iran's military kind of manufacturing capacity. And so this is probably some, and sorry, a lot of these facilities, unlike, let's say, the actual missile bases or some of the nuclear facilities themselves, are not hardened and are not deeply buried. Right. So, yeah, I think in the short-term window where Iran, in the short-term window being the next couple of weeks or in the next month or two, I think it's going to be more difficult for Iran to replenish those. And I'll just say one last point, which I forgot to say when we were talking about the launchers. Hunting launchers is not necessarily an easy task. They're small objects kind of moving around a very large geography. The Iranians, regardless of being caught off guard, have thought about this and thought about scenarios in which they would have to conceal launchers, move them around to different locations, deal with a kind of a lack of air superiority on their own territory. And as we've seen with the case of someone like the Houthis, right, where it's maybe a comparably distant geography as far as Israel is concerned and difficult terrain. They've been able to maintain a sufficient number of their launchers to continue to make ad hoc launches. And we have experience about this going back to the time of the Gulf War. Launcher hunting, missile hunting, launcher hunting. It's not necessarily an easy job. It's easier today perhaps than it was in the past. But Iran will probably sustain some capacity to continue to launch these. But again, in my view, this will allow Iran to resist Israel in a sense and make at least a kind of a putative or a very minimal resistance. It won't be enough to deter Israel, let alone the United States.
First on, I want to ask you something about you mentioned earlier too about Iran's options now in terms of how they may respond politically and how this may play out over weeks or months of how this conflict may continue. So it seems that the Trump administration has wanted Iran, their version of a nuclear deal is essentially a capitulation on the nuclear program and some kind of Libya-style dismantlement of enrichment capacity and maybe even beyond that as well too. Uh, can you explain from the Iranian perspective why they'd be averse to this outcome specifically? Because I see it, and I think we've others have commented as well too. It could be very dangerous actually to agree to a capitulation in some cases that foregoes this capacity or a critical capacity for a state indefinitely. What would it mean for the Iranians to quote unquote make a deal now, and why would that maybe lead them to resist that as long as possible?
Yeah. Well, trying to put myself in their shoes, right? I have some kind of sense of how they're thinking, but at the end of the day, this topmost decision makers may think quite differently from the types of people I might have contact with or read online or follow online. My sense is again that regardless of whether they want or would be ready to make a very conciliatory deal with major concessions, how do you trust Trump, right? Who, depending on which narrative you believe about how early he knew about Israel's plan to strike and to what extent and from how far back he was playing along with the Rus, right, to give Iran the impression that talks were happening and that a strike on its nuclear facilities was unlikely. Why would they then, turn around almost immediately and trust Trump to sign a deal and trust that even if they're able to sign a deal with Trump, that the Israelis won't continue strikes. They have this policy, for example, in Syria called the campaign between wars, and in Gaza they use this term of mowing the lawn, right? So yeah, maybe Israel says, well, we're not going after nuclear targets, but we're going to, now that the air is open, the skies are open. In Persian, we say, or the expression has become, oh, Iran's skies are becoming or have become an autobahn, right? Like a highway where anyone can kind of gonna come and go. That's the expression being used in some of the popular and elite discourse. So then, even if Trump makes a deal, and let's say that's a nuclear deal, what guarantee do they have that the Israelis won't continue strikes within Iran on Iranian targets? The other piece of it is that, well, if they're ready to capitulate after this demonstration of strength and have no resolve to continue to fight, then I think that that opens them to the perceptions that they're weak and that other actors will then come and try to kind of muscle Iran at a moment that it's down, knowing that, oh, they're weak, they could very well concede to us to try to gain concessions. So the demonstration of weakness and lack of results invites challenge, right? And so the other aspect of it is the domestic side. Let's say, and my macro thesis thinking about how Iran is approaching this is that we have this expression in Persian, which is the English translation being drinking from the poison chalice. It's the expression that Khomeini, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, used, the leader before the current leader, when accepting a ceasefire and end to the Iran-Iraq war. So they might be willing to drink from the poison chalice and make certain major concessions. The kind of caveats there are that, one, when Khomeini does this in 1988, that was after an 8-year exhaustive war, where they really understood that regardless of kind of the approach they took, the best they could probably achieve was a stalemate. But even in that context, Iran did not capitulate to Iraq, right? The drinking from the chalice poison was accepting the end to the war, right? So it wasn't like, oh, we fought for 8 years, we drank from the poison chalice, and we completely capitulated. No, they made a compromise. They agreed to end the war without achieving regime change against Saddam Hussein, who had invaded Iran in 1980. But at the end of the day, it wasn't some form of massive capitulation. The other piece of it is, if they did want to capitulate, it would also invite potentially enormous domestic challenge, because they would also look weak to their domestic audiences, right? And it would be and once that happens, they open a door to all other forms of internal challenge. And a huge piece of this is from what we might kind of label as the hardline social base of the system in Iran, right? I think a lot of the hesitancy to make concessions on the part of the leader as well as the system is because of the kind of viewpoints of this particular group. This is as the Islamic Republic since the revolution has gradually become less popular, and especially under Khamenei, the hardcore social base of the system has shrunk to this particular group. It's very dangerous to kind of antagonize or disappoint this group at a time when the leader is quite elderly and Iran is considering making a transition. I heard about a recent kind of major discussion by foreign policy elites inside of Iran, where it seemed like across the political spectrum, except for the most hardline elements, a lot of people, including some connected to the Revolutionary Guards, felt that the acts of resistance needs to go. Right? It's no longer this conflict in the form that exists now, and the military support for the Axis, it's no longer sustainable. But why wouldn't they do it? Well, one of the people at this particular event said that, well, whoever is the one to do this could face the fate of Yitzhak Rabin. That's the specific phrasing they use. So it's very dangerous for the system to make sudden, massive concessions, opening themselves up to massive domestic challenge. And if they wanted to do that, they would have to do that over a period where they change the minds of this particular group, both at an elite and popular level.
I mean, ironically, and tell me if you think this is right, the way to do that would have been to, for the way that the U.S. could have eased them in that direction would have been to stay in the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. That probably gradually, 10 years later, you're getting to a place where maybe this like hardened system of axis of resistance isn't as necessary to keep locked in place because there's more going on, and maybe you have a broader social base at that point. I guess it's kind of doesn't matter at this point because it's didn't happen. But was that a road that wasn't taken, you think, that would have led to what you're talking about?
Absolutely. And I wouldn't start in 2015. The group that is the progenitor of this particular the specific faction in parliament that's used to refer to this group is Jebhe Paidari, which means the Perseverance Front. That's one translation of it. So the kind of origins of this group goes to kind of the late 1990s, early 2000s as a political current. There are key pivot points, both for this particular group and faction and for the leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei himself, where they're willing to test engagement with the U.S. They're willing to test limited openings in relations, cooperation, and expounding the boundaries of that. And not to put this all on the U.S. because Iran bears an enormous amount of responsibility, and going back to 1979 for how this whole process played out. So, but just putting that element aside for a moment, there are many important pivot points. Starting with the kind of approach of the Clinton administration to the Khatami government in the late 1990s, the kind of post-Afghanistan 9/11 war on terror policies, and moving forward where things that could have potentially blossomed into greater engagement that would have made somebody like the leader Khamenei in Iran less paranoid, and this group potentially either less relevant or less attractive for a certain subset of people. Those were a lot of missed opportunities. And the 2015 JCPOA was kind of one data point along this longer series, but of course a much more important one, because in 2015 they were able to put aside the distrust of the kind of post-Cold War and especially war on terror period and kind of reach a major deal. And around that time, both the Iranian president and leaders said, comments along the lines of, and with some small differences here, that, let's see how this goes. And if it goes well, maybe we can have a JCPOA 2 on this issue, and JCPOA 3 on that issue, and maybe more things will be possible. But let's see how this experience goes. And again, not to take away from any of the responsibility of the Islamic Republic for the state of affairs, but that's certainly a reality of how we got here.
Right. I wanted to ask you about what diplomatic assets and also kind of I guess military assets that Iran has as well, because we know, of course, that Israel has the support of the United States, which is remains the most powerful military in the world, but its industrial capacity has been drained by a couple of years of supporting Ukraine and then a couple of years of sending weapons to Israel. And so its stocks are getting depleted. Meanwhile, you had an interesting statement from China put out the other day that I wanted to get your reaction to and ask kind of what it means for Iran's ability to win, or at least hang tough in a war of attrition with Israel and the United States. The statement starts off with a rather they even use the word explicit. Here, I'll read this. China publicly stated its position immediately after Israel's attack on Iran. China explicitly condemns Israel's violation of Iran's sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity, and firmly opposes the reckless attacks targeting Iranian officials and causing civilian casualties. China supports Iran in safeguarding its national sovereignty, defending its legitimate rights and interests, and assuring the safety of its people. Israel's actions seriously violate the purpose and principles. So on. China also urges the countries that have influence over Israel to make concrete efforts to restore peace. I think we can guess who they're referring to there. So what does it mean for Iran that China was willing to make this explicit a statement of support? Are they going to send launchers? Are they going to send just enough weapons to keep Iran's strategic ability to create what did you call it? Mutual devastation. Because the only way I could imagine that actually playing out is if China and or Russia, made sure that Iran's stocks were able to, stay in sufficient supply to continue at least, lobs of 10 to 20 every couple days.
Yeah. So I'll start by saying that the short answer to your question is no. At the start of this conflict, at least, Iran is truly strategically alone in the sense that materially, I think no country will lift a finger, whether it's in terms of substantive military, financial, or other forms of material support to help Iran in this war. Part of the reason that the Islamic Republic created the axis of resistance was that it was lonely in the region of the world, and so it created its own allies and network of allies. Although Syria certainly was a partner and became more closely embedded in the axis of resistance, but that's part of the reason that it had to do what it did. Now, not only does it not have treaty allies who would intervene on its behalf, and while the recent agreement with Russia, provides for them not helping countries attacking the other, there's no kind of mutual aid necessarily or a mutual defense kind of provisions in there, and the axis of resistance is effectively destroyed. My understanding is Hezbollah retains from as little as 20% to potentially higher of its strategic weapons capable to strike Israel. This is part of the overall reason, at least in its evolution, that Iran supported the creation of Hezbollah, right? Was for precisely the scenario. Although that's not the whole story, and it's not the only element. But in recent years, that was a key, and not even Hezbollah is in a position, nor I think I've heard grumblings. Do many of its members? I don't know about the top leadership, but want to intervene on behalf of Iran after kind of the events of the last 2 years. So it's truly strategically alone. Now, what's been, I guess, a little bit heartening from the perspective of the Islamic Republic is that the regional states, they've also put out a statement which was very strongly in support of Iran. I think as kind of the situation has evolved since the 7th of October, a lot of the countries, the kind of strong alignment of many states against Iran has softened, right? The states, especially in the Arab world, which were cooperating much more closely with Israel, have either kind of frozen or backed off some of that cooperation. And more recently, especially since the start of this war, I think it's quickly becoming apparent to other powerful states like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, that if Iran is completely defeated, Israel would at least, in a sense, be left hegemonic in the region, and they're starting to think about the scenarios in which that negatively affects their own interests, based on the various things they're looking to pursue, including their own nuclear programs, right? So I think immediately that very strong united diplomatic support from the rest of the region will be heartening for the Islamic Republic, and a show of support, and a show that those countries will try to be very careful to allow their territory and other resources to be used for attacks on Iran. In the case of Russia and China, again, Iran and Russia have been coordinating quite closely on the nuclear portfolio for quite a few years, right? And that alignment has gotten closer over time. And, in my kind of short to medium term scenario, 3 to 12 months, I don't necessarily foresee actual arms supply happening. Although we did see, after Israel struck some of Iran's facilities in October, the Chinese providing certain fuel and potentially other components to help replenish its missile stocks. So we could see that slowly accelerate. And, it's hard to see right now, but going further down the road, depending on how this conflict evolves, that certainly is an option that could become activated and kind of help support Iran's resistance to Israel if it indeed does take that path.
It's interesting, actually, from a Chinese perspective, even a Russian perspective as well, too. Draining down the U.S., the U.S. defense stocks actually is very much in their interest, because these interceptors, some of these batteries, a whole year can only produce 100 or so. And if the Israelis are drawing them down at such a high rate, maybe at some point it determines their interest to keep forcing the U.S. to deploy more and more. And there has been some talk that there are people in the Pentagon who want to redeploy some batteries currently in South Korea to Israel as well, too, which would further, from a Chinese perspective, if their goal is to actually at some point have a confrontation or some sort of move in East Asia and Taiwan, be beneficial. It would actually clear the way for them. So it's interesting how this develops over time. Farzan, I want to ask you something specifically about the Iranian public reaction to the war to date, and with the caveat that obviously it's a big country and there's diverse views and so forth. But it's interesting. I've been talking to people in Iran, friends and people I know generally, and about the subject for a very long time before this war, and I found that in Iran there was diversity of opinion, as I said, different camps, but a lot of people had an ambivalent view of this conflict, or they wanted to stay out of it, or something like that, or they were not. There's a very, very interesting mosaic of views. What I've seen in the last week or so, people have been infuriated and shocked, especially by the scenes of the attacks in Tehran, which started the war. And reports to date are not completely complete, but we see maybe several hundred people who've been killed in these attacks, far beyond just the leaders of the IRGC who were targeted. There were attacks killed their neighbors, their family members, passersby. We saw destruction of major residential areas, affluent areas of Tehran, famous parts of the city, which were also struck in these attacks, which seem to be not by any means limited to the nuclear program at all, but aiming at the core of the state, ostensibly, in the view of it. How are people in Iran? How do you see their views potentially being shaped or evolving so far as a result of the conflict and how it's played out?
So first, I think any information I have, like you, is anecdotal, and it's really too soon to tell. People are still in shock. What I will say is that in the past, when Israel's operation, for example, in the campaign between wars starting roughly in 2012 to 2024, where Israel was consistently striking Iranian forces in Syria, by my kind of very rough preliminary estimate, I'd been planning on writing something bigger on it, but then the Assad regime collapsed and there wasn't much of a point. But my estimate was something like 50 to 100 IRGC officers might have been killed. That in somewhere in that range, and so that elicited, of course, outrage from the social base of the system. It elicited maybe some broader outrage, but it was quite limited because the kind of Israeli messaging and the perception on the Iranian side was, well, they're targeting the IRGC. It's not even the army, which is maybe seen as a much more of a national institution compared to IRGC by a certain segment of the society. And also, in many of those cases, the Islamic Republic kind of covered it up, or they would announce the martyrdom, but they wouldn't necessarily play it up as, now we need to go after Israel, we need to retaliate right away, right? So I think the outrage, to the extent that it existed, was more contained, especially because during this decade and leading up to 2022, we've had massive rounds of anti-system protests, which have gotten consistently larger, longer, and more violent, and more violently anti-system in their rhetoric and approach, right? So there was, on a certain part of the segment of the population, and we can speculate about how big or small it was, there was outrage. And so when these types of things happened, in some corners, there would be even expressions of joys, right? And maybe on social media or here or there. that's, maybe at the very start that of this, on the first day, some may have had that reaction, but my sense is that as the kind of scale of the attacks continue to expand, right, and the targets go from being military and nuclear targets, in which in many cases are secret military facilities in remote areas, to urban areas where people have attachments to, fond memories of, where they have relatives, where they live themselves, that outrage is spreading. And what I would say is that I'm starting to see a, let's say, nationalist backlash, but I don't know, and it'll be hard to know whether that nationalist backlash with, in relation to Israel will translate into a rally or a large scale rally around the system in Iran, some would call the regime, right? That remains to be seen. And there's two factors behind that. One is that obviously the catastrophic security failures of the Islamic Republic is what led to this in the first place. One of the main kind of, let's say, narratives of the system, especially since the ISIS period, the rise of ISIS in the 2010s, is to try to present itself as protecting the security of the nation much better than previous nation regimes, right? And presenting itself as a defender of the nation. We didn't give up an inch of soil. We protected security. Well, this undermines that entire narrative and raison d'être. It was not the only raison d'être of the system, but it's one of the ones they've been kind of promoting the best. The other thing is that, for example, from some of the messaging of the system I've seen so much, they're sticking to the stale formula, which again appeals to maybe their hardcore base, but doesn't have that bigger, broader appeal. They need a change of message, but I'm not sure if they're able to or feel they can make that type of fit. Again, it's too soon. Sorry, a third quick thing I'll throw in there. In the Iran-Iraq war, where there was a genuine rally around the flag effect after the revolution, obviously society was much more ideologically charged and motivated. But you also had Iraqis entering Iranian territory, occupying that territory, shooting people, killing soldiers. In this case, it's much more in the air. So that time and how long this conflict takes, the kind of damage it's doing, and the system's ability to channel it and to recoup will be kind of a big factor. And just to give a very, very tiny anecdotal example, when they struck the state media facility yesterday, the state television, in my view, is, let me put it very plain, it's not a good institution. And in a different Iran, it would be at the very least heavily reformed. And you could see the person who was kind of delivering that message was doing it in a way that I don't believe would have appealed to most Iranians. But also that the building they putting aside that you shouldn't murder media workers, right? Putting that very basic thing aside, right? That building was also part of Iran's architectural heritage. And I've seen just a lot of outrage from people who are lovers of the architectural landscape of the city saying, hey, they're not only killing the IRGC, they're destroying the country's kind of security, the infrastructure, and a lot of what makes this country great and beautiful. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. You had mentioned earlier, and I wanted to just see if you could elaborate on it just briefly, that some of the leadership elements within the various axis of resistance groups have been frustrated with Iran's posture over the last couple years since October 7th. What is that? What's that frustration? What are they angry about? What do they wish that Iran had done versus what they did do?
Well, I mean, different groups have, and their memberships have expressed frustration in different ways or along different lines. My kind of sense, and this was to some extent reflected in some of the axis resistance thinking and some of the thinking inside the system, but it's not the policy position that went out. This was not a position that I was advocating. But after the 7th of October and after the outrage about the murder of Israeli Jews that kind of happened in that horrific, brutal attack, once that had subsided, my kind of thinking or my assessment of the situation was that unless the Islamic Republic immediately and massively coordinated with the axis of resistance to bring kind of overwhelming fire and power to bear, to try to force Israel and its patron, the U.S., into a ceasefire, right? Israel would have the comfort and space to systematically dismantle the axis of resistance and then start to enter Iran and start to dismantle the air defenses, and that's kind of exactly what unfolded. And I know that there was a sense that there would be inside some elements of the Islamic of the Islamic resistance, that there would be some unification of the fronts, and for this strategy to kind of be used. Now, I don't know whether that would have actually worked. It's possible that actually the backlash and outrage would have been such that it would have just fast tracked what already happened, right? But that was probably their best chance once the initial outrage out internationally over the 7th of October massacre died down, for them to try to force the other side to the negotiating table and have a ceasefire. My sense is some others in the acts of resistance and the Islamic Republic itself felt that way, but Iran's leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has always been quite cautious and conservative, and that's not how it played out.
Farzan, I want to ask you something. There was a text message which Trump shared today on Truth Social from Mike Huckabee, the U.S. ambassador to Israel. And the text message seems like a private text message between him and Huckabee. But Huckabee was lavishing praise on Trump for, effectively rising to the moment as he sees it. And he used the example of Truman in 1945, which is a very evocative example for a number of reasons. It seems that the U.S. is moving its assets in place potentially to attack Iran, or at least giving itself the option of launching a very, very significant attack against Iran. What do you see as the possible? Put this one. What do you see as a possible series of events if the U.S. does end up attacking Iran? Because what we've heard so far is that American focus would be on the Fordow nuclear plant, a fortified underground nuclear facility, very important to the Iranian nuclear program. But as we've seen in the last week, the Israeli attacks have extended far beyond the nuclear program. They've hit core regime functions. And there's no reason necessarily to believe that an American intervention would be limited to Fordow or nuclear sites either. Given the fact that Iran also does have a forced posture in the Persian Gulf, which is much, much more, at least on paper, far more developed to strike targets in the Gulf, strike potentially Gulf countries or U.S. bases in these countries. And it seems like there was a likelihood or a strong possibility of U.S. casualties if there was a direct confrontation between Iran and the U.S. How could the escalatory or retaliatory cycle play out if the U.S. does start attacking either nuclear sites or sites key to the government, including its leadership?
Yeah. So just a little bit of background, in the policy and academic space that I operate in, we have a lot of track 2 and track 1.5 diplomacy with current and former officials from various countries. And something I consistently heard from former U.S. officials who had worked with Israel, and in many cases were intensely pro-Israel themselves, was that they understood any Israeli strike on the Iranian nuclear program as just being the start of a process with the intention to eventually bring in U.S. intervention to finish the job, right? I tend to think along similar lines, which is that I don't think Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu would take the risk of initiating this assault. My sense is that the actual substantive damage and setback of Iran's program has been limited. And now that it's going, it might be kind of supercharged, have more resources put into it and dispersed and kind of hardened and further compartmentalized. It might be even harder to pursue. I don't see how you start this without a plan to finish the job. And I think that could, I can see two kind of scenarios based on consultations that I've done with U.S., Israeli, and other officials. The first, which is the Israel go it alone option, would be a commando raid, right? Now, for a commando raid, obviously the air superiority, which is the Israeli Air Force has established in kind of the triangle between the city of Tabriz, Esfahan, and Tehran, in which which is kind of Iran's population industrial heartland, and which a lot of these locations are located, that allows them then to go in and suppress the local defenses around a major facility like Fordow. And it makes the prospect of a large-scale commando raid much better compared to what it would have been in the past, right? In terms of achieving success. But Israel, at the end of the day, using non-nuclear means at least, is not able to destroy a facility like Fordow or newer facilities, for example, one near or chambers or subsets of facilities that Iran is, for example, building near Natanz. Israel does not possess the non-nuclear capability to destroy those from the air. And so the U.S. would have to come in and finish the job in this second option, which I think is much safer and kind of certain of success than the first option. And to carry out this option, in my view, the way he sells it to President Trump is, listen, this campaign is going great so far. We're reaching kind of the end of the current operational cycle. I think he set a 2-week deadline, and that 2-week deadline might have to do with the cost, ability to replenish fuel, logistics, kind of munitions, and kind of other constraints that they face. So he comes in and says, "Listen, this is one and done." I literally heard a think tanker from Washington D.C. say, "Listen, just one bomb." Right, just one more bomb. So the way it could be sold to him, and the way it's probably going to be sold to him, is that, listen, it's not literally one bomb, but it's a one-off operation, which I think, like the Soleimani assassination, it is a type of kind of option that would be attractive to Trump and show the U.S. being tough, and from Trump's perspective, maybe strengthening America's leverage. And you sell it as a one and done operation. Trump goes in, destroys Fordow. The Israelis mop up other nuclear facilities, other kind of officials, other military facilities and infrastructure. And let's keep in mind, they also have what I kind of politely called Mossad's legion of kind of defectors on the ground. It seems to be a massive entity to also support them there, right? They kind of wrap it up in this kind of short window. My sense is that if they then either don't assassinate the senior political leadership and overall leadership, or if they don't make a decisive move at this stage towards regime change, the destruction of Fordow by itself would elicit an Iranian response. It would not be the Samson option or like the overwhelming response, which they're probably saving for a catastrophic apocalyptic regime change scenario. And so what they would likely do is maybe short range ballistic missile strikes on U.S. facilities in the region and increase harassment in the Persian Gulf and around the Strait of Hormuz, maybe slowing traffic, increasing the risk perception of actors of kind of going through there, and then them trying to look for some alternative routes, and maybe sabotage using clandestine means of oil and other energy export facilities in the region. But over the destruction of Fordow by itself, given how things are evolving, and again, the catastrophic failure of Iranian deterrence and Iranian security, I don't necessarily see that as triggering the kind of all-out scenario, which many people, at least in the Persian Gulf side and energy side, which many people are concerned with.
So if it's unlikely that there will be some major retaliation, and it looks you can sell it to Trump as like one more operation, seems to me almost guaranteed that it would happen. You never want to make any predictions like that, but it does seem like strongly headed in the direction that the U.S. will hit Fordow. Is that your analysis?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I just don't see how you start this and you don't then finish it. Yeah.
And what does that mean? What does that mean for the?
Sorry, I'll make one caveat. So before Iran's strike, I think it was on the 13th or 14th of April, they called Operation True Promise 1. I wouldn't have predicted that the Islamic Republic would have done an attack of that scale and engaged in such risk-taking behavior, right? But they did. So I should put in this caveat that this is my assessment, and it's probably how it'll be sold to President Trump. But it's possible that the Islamic Republic, as its claims, held back certain capacities, or that it'll indeed feel like if it doesn't use it now, then this is the point to try to stop it, rather than, again, allow this attrition and degradation to kind of continue over time, right?
What does it mean for the nuclear program if Fordow is destroyed?
Fordow, which is one of the more secure facilities in Iran in terms of being deeply underground, alongside some of the other kind of infrastructure and personnel that were destroyed. I've seen estimates that it'll set back, the destruction of that plus those other things would set back the program a year plus. It's hard to do an exact assessment of, this far out from the end of the campaign. But at the same time, Iran, even before this was happening, had started to divert certain material to other facilities that were known. Probably at this point, it reduces kind of IAEA oversight and kind of knowledge of to the extent that it had of its kind of centrifuge manufacturing, existing centrifuge cascades, a stockpile of enriched uranium and other materials that go into kind of that nuclear fuel cycle life cycle, and it starts to divert it into smaller, more compartmentalized, secretive facilities, and so from there, our estimates will start to fall apart. Right, we'll be able to kind of have a sense of it, but on the other hand, we don't know what kind of other support they'll be receiving, how much resources they'll be pumping into this, how much they'll be able to improve or increase security. I'll note that in terms of sabotage within nuclear facilities, from the kind of period of assassination of nuclear scientists in the mid 2000s through Stuxnet and then through some of the major sabotage operations, the Islamic Republic did a major overhaul of its kind of counterintelligence as it relates to nuclear facilities. So there was kind of previously an interagency arrangement, at least for the interior non-air defense part of the facilities, and that a lot of that was then consolidated under what's been called something like the Nuclear Security and Protection Corps, which is a subsidiary element of the Islamic Revolution Guard Corps. And so since there haven't, as far as I've been able to see, successful sabotage operations within a lot of these facilities, although they've successfully killed a lot of scientists, but those were kind of remote attacks. And long range attacks. But sir, maybe actually their counterintelligence has gotten more effective. Maybe they do learn. Maybe some of Israel's bank of kind of intelligence gets used up, and so this process, whether Fordow is destroyed or not, dispersing the program, kind of eliminating any continuity of knowledge that the IAEA or broader Western intelligence community has about the state of Iran's nuclear program, will be somewhat successful. And so Iran will be able to reconstitute a more effective nuclear weapons program. And at that point, pressure for building a bomb, I don't know if a definitive decision's been made on that. I think very few people would know that. But certainly pressure for that to happen. We saw it increase after Operation True Promise 1 and the Israeli strike on the Iranian consulate in Syria in April 2024. After something like this, it's likely, at least within the system, and we'll see maybe even in the broader society, likely that have upward pressure on it. And so we'll see kind of from there. So there the program could be reconstituted. But again, given the catastrophic failures we've seen in Iranian security, I don't know if I have confidence that they have the ability to do that.
Farzan, to kind of get at your point too, if the U.S. destroys Fordow and the program is dispersed around the country, and there's this political pressure to weaponize, and the IAEA oversight is limited or even eliminated in the future, it seems like this would necessitate, if you're serious about stopping an Iranian nuclear program, continued attacks on Iran for a very, very long time. And even in Iraq in 2003, the U.S. had to eventually send people on the ground, literally, to verify what was there and what was not there. And even when you attack a facility, you need to do a battle damage assessment in a hardened facility. How do you verify if you destroyed everything? It seems that this policy potentially, even if it's sold to Trump as a one-off, it logically necessitates much, much greater engagement for potentially years to come to verify that Iranians who are maybe more motivated now to have a nuclear weapon are not pursuing one outside of monitoring. Do you see this as a possible outcome of an initial strike, maybe kind of reeling the United States into a far greater military involvement than maybe it's been being portrayed to Trump at the moment?
Potentially. I think the more likely immediate scenario, or short to medium term, again, this is 3 to 12 month scenario, is that if Israel doesn't indeed stop with the goals of significantly degrading and setting back the nuclear program and certain military programs and this assassination campaign, if it stops there, again, like I said before, we'll shift into kind of a campaign between wars or mowing the grass kind of situation. So I think, and that's something I think Israel would probably feel comfortable it can do quite comfortably, at least during this period. Of course, is there a pretext created then along the way that starts the creep towards regime change? Of course. I mean, both in terms of the dynamics of Iran's nuclear weapons option, which started under the Shah, right? And this was part of my own research, interviewing U.S. officials and others. The interest started then, but the logic has kind of evolved over time. But there's kind of an inevitability to it, right? As both sides have been pushed further down this line, you know, it's there's increased pressure for Iran to build a bomb, and then the open war has broken out. This was the scenario we've been trying to prevent for like more than a decade, 2 decades, right? And so then there's also a similar dynamic pushing towards regime change, and I see the pressures behind both of those being mutually reinforcing and kind of pushing those forward.
Well, Farzan, I know we kept you longer than you had initially thought, but it was greatly appreciated. Any final thoughts on what people should understand about this conflict as it unfolds?
Yeah, just be cautious about simple solutions, that's being sold for you. Also, there's a broader debate about regime change happening. I'm not sure if that's something you were interested in going into, but from the perspective of, I think, a lot of Iranians, a lot of people are now openly out and calling for that, right? So there's a certain small subset of the population which is vocal about it. Is there another larger silent group that feels the same way but isn't saying it? Maybe, right? But there's also, I don't see like a great model to to try to sell this both to Western audiences and to Iranian audiences at home, right? At home inside of Iran. Like what are the models there? We have Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, in terms of various forms of intervention that happened, those are not necessarily very attractive models. And then in terms of what the future looks like for Iranians, the Israelis in their public messaging towards Iranians have been, very careful, historically at least, to try to distinguish between the regime and non-regime, terrorists and non-terrorists, right? But the type of campaign that's shaping up inside of Iran resembles much more the campaigns in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria that we've seen in the last few years, especially since the 7th of October. And I think as that distinction breaks down, and I think there was also a more subtle signaling that, we don't view Iranians the same way we view Arabs, right? We put you on there's a special relationship. We put you in kind of a different category. As those distinctions that were that kind of historically framed the messaging and some of the mutual understanding, at least at the social level, break down. Right. I think, there's a danger that the situation in Iran becomes similar to that of Gaza or Lebanon or Syria, except we're dealing with a country of 90 million, and the potentially destabilizing outcomes of that are very, it's very terrible to think about.
Yeah, I know Murtaz and I have been speaking to people in Iran, and like you said, it's all anecdotal. One of them told me that at least in his more educated circle, more people were kind of angry at the Iranian government for kind of allowing this to happen, for the security failure and the strategic failures that led to this situation. But of course, we're also, furious about the nature of the attack, and unsure about whether or not the government would even survive, and ambivalent almost because of what you said, the unknown on the other side, and the lack of any good examples that would say, oh yeah, well, maybe we can become like X country that had a Western driven regime change and emerged on the other side with this flourishing society, rather than what has typically emerged, which is just decades of sectarian conflict and death. And does that gel with what you've been hearing?
Absolutely. I see a lot of ambivalence in society, both because, again, in a certain segment of society, it's, certain part of the society will, is already completely dedicated to the system. A certain segment and a certain broader group will, on that end of the spectrum, rally around the system. But a huge segment of society, both inside of and outside, will be ambivalent, right? Both at the scenes of destruction, but also the failures of the Islamic Republic, not only in this episode, but over time. What I will say is that my kind of assessment regarding the issue of regime change, at least in this short to medium term, 3 to 12 month period, and putting aside the question of assassination of the top leadership. So that's kind of a factor I take out for the moment. I think it's unlikely to see any kind of system regime change, regime collapse, or regime falls. Regimes typically don't fall. Somebody needs to push them, right? And what you need is an agent or an actor with sufficient organization, discipline, and force to do the pushing. And I have not to this date seen in the literature a case of regime change being done purely from the air, which is what Israel is doing. From what I understand, and you guys are the U.S. kind of experts that I and other follows for your views on the U.S., but I think U.S. led on the ground invasion, occupation, regime change is also off the table. And on the other hand, there's maybe potential in the opposition, but whether it's armed groups on the peripheries of Iran or the opposition as it exists today, with maybe one small exception, not really again well organized, unified, strong, disciplined opposition, which can come and give the push if over a period of months, years, whatever, the next year, the Islamic Republic continues to hollow out and become much weaker. That leaves the possibility of either elite defection or a coup. Right. In terms of elite defection, typically in these types of revolutionary regimes, the elites become less dedicated to the system and more careerist and opportunist as you go down generations. I think that's kind of what you see with the late Soviet Union and kind of Yeltsin's own, fighting, kind of defecting from the Soviet system, even though within that system he was the leader of the Russian SSR, right? To start the process of the collapse of the Soviet Union. But in China, as in Iran, at least in China with Tiananmen Square and Iran, let's say today, you still have those first generations, second generation of leadership in the top positions. They fought the revolution, they lived and survived through the Iran-Iraq wars, which in some way was much tougher than this. They've suffered, actually, believe it or not, somewhat more catastrophic, at least political leadership, as well as some military losses in the past, right? So this group tends to have a much higher level of resolve, at least historically, and if they're not all assassinated, to resist, and much level of unity with one another. And they would rather circle the wagons and fight and resist than see the regime fall and deal with those consequences. On the kind of military-led transformation side, this might be a little bit controversial, but actually, if you follow the IRGC and the kind of biographies of the various commanders closely, some of the people most likely in a certain context to start or support that process of system transformation, or even in some cases system change, are the very ones, and these are people with a lot of authority, a lot of charisma, a lot of support within the armed forces, are precisely the ones that have been assassinated. The two biggest figures that, of course, come to mind are Qasem Soleimani, who was assassinated in 2020, as well as Mohammad Bagheri, the commander of the armed forces. So as you move down the chain of command, you get to kind of maybe commanders who might attempt something like that, but they wouldn't have the same ability or certainty of being able to pull it off, right? And so that also makes me question the chances of military kind of led change. And just to put a kind of bow on it, in a lot of these scenarios, you're potentially looking at a scenario of civil war. I don't think the current structure of Iranian society or the conditions there permits that type of a long, protracted, bloody civil wars, nor does Iranian society have an appetite for it. So again, in this short to medium term period, I don't see the prospect of regime collapse, regime kind of fall, regime change. But it's a fluid situation. Certain things could happen tomorrow or in a week or 2 weeks that would change that assessment.
Yeah.
All right, well, Farzan Sabet, thank you so much for joining us. Maz, thank you as well.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, so
thank you so much. Thanks for having me on. It was a pleasure.
Yeah. I'm Ryan Grimm. This was our Tuesday live stream on behalf of my colleague Maz and all of us here at Dropsite News. Thank you so much for watching. Your support makes this possible. Go to dropsitenews.com. Become a paid subscriber to keep this journalism going. We're also, contributions to Dropsite are tax deductible. If you go to donate.dropsitenews.com, you can become a one-time or recurring subscriber there. Again, thank you so much for joining. We'll see you next time.